but how do we make it in a way that there's more of these check-ins, that there's more of these alternative forms of wellness that still consider us people, like us racialized folks, in a way that we feel cared for.
Welcome back to the fam, y'all. And I guess Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
It's been a minute.
It has been.
I don't even know how to introduce y'all. I mean, my name is Parker Johnson. To my left, I've got...
Hi, I'm Dr. Lisa Gunderson, Dr. G.
To my right.
Hey, it's Pamphinette Buisa here.
Like I said, it's been a minute, and we were trying to decide what we wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Because there's been so much to cover.
Yeah.
It sounds like we've landed on stigma around counseling, accessing counseling in our community.
Yeah.
Because it is something that I think is incredibly relevant, I know, for the men in my life, in my own journey, tapping into counseling, and you, a clinical psychologist.
Clinical psychologist.
We got to talk about it. And then, of course, with your background in athletics, I'm curious around psychology and counseling, but also as a recent student,
Yeah.
the importance of accessing counseling while you're going through that grind, but also why is there so much stigma and why is it difficult for us to tap into counseling? Accessibility reasons aside, because it is very expensive.
Yeah.
But let's start there. Who wants to go?
I'm not going to start. It wasn't my idea. I just want to say I am the counselor, clinical psychologist here and the RCC, so I'm going to throw it to you
She
because
added
it was
another
your
title.
idea.
You know, she's
On
like
it.
subtle flex.
Yeah.
And
BC,
yeah,
because we're in
yeah,
BC.
yeah.
Yeah,
RCC,
well,
BC.
one thing I was noticing, particularly, like, I just finished my degree
Let's go.
in December. And a huge thing, you know, I was kind of melting. I was taking 6 classes,
Oh my gosh.
trying to crunch because I was like looking at the time and I was like, I just want it done.
Yeah.
And, you know, while I was so focused on doing, there was a lot of like external, the internal was just not being touched upon. And I was grateful that at least I had a good support system,
Yeah.
but also I have a therapist. And I think one thing, I was talking with my little sister actually, and she was just talking about mental health and things like that. And then in our conversations between me and my sibling was how she brought that up to her parents and they're like, what's wrong with you? Are you okay? And like the fear of expressing for us, like our immigrant parents from, that don't necessarily have therapy in a way that's accepted necessarily in our communities, and how for her the advice that she was looking for was from me, and that was really interesting, and it's something I've actually noticed in a lot of people I talk to in our community about how there's not, especially when we talk to our parents, particularly our immigrant parents, oftentimes talking about therapy, there's a lot of stigma around it, and there's an association that if you are seeking therapy, there's something wrong with you. There's not much of a conversation around like being proactive to, you know, bounce these ideas back and things like that. And that made me really question, like, why is it that there's so much this stigma, there's so much charge around going to therapy, and it's like super taboo to talk about it. When I really know that there's so many aunties and uncles that could really, really, really need therapy, right? So yeah, that's kind of.
We're looking at you, boomers. Y'all have the best benefits in the country. Please,
Right.
just go.
Therapy.
Please,
Yes.
I'll go with you. You know what I mean? Like, we can all go.
Yep.
But it's fascinating to me. I know my experience, I was late to the game. And it wasn't until, I think, my first year I was in college, and I was like, let me just, I'm a psych student. I should probably go.
Fair.
You know,
Yeah.
my reasoning was, I know that's not great reasoning to go, but like,
But hey.
let me go. And I go, and the person doesn't look like me and was currently being supervised. So they set up a camera. And I'm like, this just feels like an interrogation.
Yikes.
Yeah.
I'm not really feeling
Yeah.
this. And then I started asking my friends of like, where do you go? Like, we don't go. One, the wait lists are so long.
Yeah.
Oh,
And also it's really, really hard to find diverse counselors.
yeah.
So fast forward, I've had the same counselor for, oh man, it's gotta be 7 years at least.
It's like a hairdresser.
I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it
And we
really
have
is,
Zoom
though.
now, so
is.
wherever you go, I go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Loyal.
Yeah.
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 That makes sense. You know, it's interesting because when I first decided to get into psychology, and I called my mom to tell her, because I'd gone to university saying I'm going to be, a medical doctor, and then I go to undergrad, and I was like, I took this psych class, and I was like, what?
Yeah, yeah.
And in, chemistry and biology, I'm like the phylum of a tree. I really just don't care. So I remember telling my mom that I was going to go to grad school and get a PhD in psych. And it's the same amount of time as medical school and all this other stuff. And she's like, what? You're going to go get a degree in psychology? Oh, what kind of nonsense is that? And my father was on the phone too. And my mom was so furious. You go to that university and you find a psychology? What psychology? And she just hung up on me straight up.
Okay.
And I was like, and I started crying. And my dad said, you know what, Lisa, if that's what you think, you go. Your mom will come around. And speed forward, years later, and my mom, she totally did. But what was interesting was what you said, is that the idea of you going to a psychologist, like you've been through your friends,
Yep.
your pastor, your other friends, pastor friends, like it's like the last thing that you would do.
Yep.
And many countries don't even have, for example, psychology has a subject back then. Now things have kind of shifted,
Yep.
but the stigma is still there. And I think part of that stigma, we actually I was part of a research study over 20 years ago, looking at how racialized folks underutilize mental health services. And a couple of the reasons, one, the way we've been treated in
Yeah.
the past.
Fair.
And that is fair, it's legitimate. We have been really abused and used in very horrific ways in terms of that. Second, accessibility, right? The money to take and to go to somebody. Third, not having anybody who looks like us.
Yeah.
And that is hugely problematic. I literally have had clients who've come to me because the therapists that they're with, who may be white, and they're trying to talk to them, say about racism, they're like, I love my therapist, but they don't get it. And I need to have this kind of conversation. Or we've had people who've gone to therapy and got out because they were busy teaching the therapist.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
boy.
that is like, I'm paying you for
Yeah.
you to understand about me.
Yeah.
That speaks to the structural problems and issues of how we're trained,
How
right?
are we learning?
And how we're learning.
Yeah.
So part of it, I think, is that. And then the other question is very westernized. And so being part of Black psychology, learning different ways that we actually do therapy that are more community centered and oriented, because our people have ways of being and having Black joy and being able to help each other.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily integrated in the ways that we're taught. We actually have to unlearn quite a bit of that. But that's one of the reasons why I do community therapy, and why even in grad school I would go to community, because I understood community wasn't going to come inside necessarily. Yeah.
It's interesting you say about seeing a therapist, because I felt like I was never, now I look back and I can say, yeah, it probably was stigma. And I was like, yeah, therapy's great, but for you, like not for me. And it wasn't really until the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So that was happening. And then COVID was happening.
Yes.
And at that time I was also working at a
Yes.
temporary housing shelter, where I was used to, it used to be a hotel, and we used to have hotel guests.
you
And
did.
now we
Yep.
completely transitioned to working with folks who are unhoused, people of many different disenfranchised communities. I'm watching overdoses on the camera as things
Yeah.
are happening. So
Yeah.
very traumatic things that I was like not even used to seeing. And all of this is happening at the same time, in a personal life, the Olympics that was supposed to happen, we didn't know it was going to happen at all.
Yeah.
So I'm just
Yeah.
like, all different angles I felt like I couldn't do.
Yeah.
And I also couldn't go back home because my mom's immunocompromised. So there was so much happening. And at that time, I'd call my friends, and I wasn't the most, let's say, emotionally expressive. And I'd be like, hey, I really care about you at like midnight. And my friends are like checking in on me, and that panicked me. I actually was panicked. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm leaking. Like, you've seen my emotions. Like, it was, and at that point I realized that in that space, especially as like, I kind of was pushed into this like frontline worker role,
Yeah.
that there was a lot of space that I was giving to folks about, you know, them sharing their stories. But I also then did not know how to deal with everything that I was exposed to.
Yeah.
And that was the reason why. I think it was just like all of a sudden I'm like in my car, and that would be like my place to like decompress. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I don't know, and I feel very uncomfortable because I feel like I want to cry, but I can't. And that was the loudest thing for me. I was like, I think I need to talk to someone. And I realized
So
when I was
good.
looking about finding ideas around this,
So
and I was
good.
like, these are the criteria I need. I need someone that, especially with my role with the BLM movement here in
Yeah.
Victoria,
Yeah.
I need to speak to someone who looks like me. And so then I found different resources, and that significantly helped me for like 4 years
Oh, I'm
after
sure.
that, of
Yeah.
just like being able to not necessarily need to explain who I am and how I am
Yeah.
in that specific regard.
Yeah.
And also my therapist was based in Atlanta, Georgia, where there was also a lot of things that
Nice.
were like, you know, BLM things that were going on there. And like some of the things I didn't need to explain necessarily because it was just understood
Yeah.
in a different way. And obviously there's nuances because, you know, my parents are immigrants and I was born here and things like that. So our histories are different, but I think just that common understanding of what it's like being Black, especially during a time where all of a sudden the visibility is so loud,
Yeah.
that was like the first thing that came to me about like, I need help. And also I don't know how to cry. Like that was like, how do I do that? And that was kind of like my end.
There's something you said that I think is so powerful and gives me hope, which is you had a therapist in Atlanta. And because of social media today
Yeah.
and technology and more of an awareness around our mental wellness, we have people now who are able to do those kind of things.
Yeah.
And that is huge. The stigma still being there, and there's really active, you know, movements to make that not be so much a stigma. But within our own community, we need to share our stories about things that have been helpful. And we also, though, have to fight for structural changes, because when our people then do choose to go and have a terrible experience, that can have huge ramifications, like ripples everywhere. And so after the murder of George Floyd, the BCACC reached out to me. So they look at the body of registered clinical counselors, that they wanted to do something meaningful. And one of the things that we ended up landing on is a box where you could check for an IBOC therapist, because you weren't able to do that before. Because that was one of the things, trying to find somebody. And then the second piece was making racialized violence and trauma an actual category
Wow.
of therapy. And then the third was to create internally an IBOC, Indigenous Black People of Color space. Because being a therapist and being one of the few,
Yeah.
it's a lot.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out how you're going to move becomes a lot. And so I always say, when it comes to mental wellness, we have to think about it not just in terms of ourselves and our communities, but the structures that create barriers
Yeah.
that stop us from going forth, right?
Something that intrigues me about at least my counseling experience is I'm curious about the somatic piece. I've never done any somatic experiencing, but I know that there are things you talk about, oh, I'm not able to cry. I know there are things that get trapped in my body that need to express. And I
Yes.
have my outlets to do that, but in a therapeutic sense, being in a Black body, I know that there are things that are locked in there deep.
Yeah.
And I know with the men in my life, the guys that I got around my life, there's so much armor on, and you know, we can go to all the men's circles we want, But if nobody's saying anything,
Yeah.
then
Yes.
what are we doing?
Yeah.
Yes. And you make an excellent point in that, again, the way that many people were trained in counseling is from a certain Western European type of lens. And so we know across the world that there's therapy and there's different ways to do it.
Yeah.
And so what would be great is how we start to infuse that
Yeah.
and take us back to some of our cultural ways of doing that and what that looks like for being a Black man, you know, and these things being trapped because they're trapped for a reason. That's part of our survival mechanism in this society, right? So the release of that has to be done, I think, in a different way
Yeah.
than we have been trained
Yeah.
to do, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And knowing where it's safe
Yes.
To do so.
To
To
do
do
so.
so
100%.
is so key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think about also knowing that I also, you know this, was an outreach worker for years. I didn't recognize how many little triggers I would have that I couldn't, something would happen and it would trigger something in me, a physiological reaction
Yeah.
or emotional reaction, but I would have to tuck it because I have a job to do. But that would be stored. And I also didn't have the language to define
Yeah.
all of these things that I was experiencing.
Absolutely.
And so when I was able to just start to conceptualize this and bounce these ideas and these feelings off of somebody who looked like me, who shared a lived experience, I know that's very hard to find in a counselor, but it's definitely helped me build a baseline.
And we need to do that. That's one of the things here in BC that I think is unique to us as Black folk in BC. Like if you go to Toronto, you're going to find organizations and things like that. We have more of a challenge here
Yeah,
just
yeah.
because our population is smaller.
Yeah.
And so like one of the things I miss is when I was in the States, I had the Black Psychological Association.
Right.
Because like you said, we have all this stuff that's still, you know, and things to unravel and unwrap, et cetera, to help. And the key for us is how do we do that kind of here? And one of the things is thinking about like individual one-on-one versus a group because there's so much need,
Yeah.
right? And it's also the reality that the majority of therapists are not going to look like us.
Yeah.
So how do we train them
Yeah.
to not perpetuate
The harm.
racialized violence and harm
Yeah.
on us, right? Like something has to happen in that way in order for us to be able to kind of get the help we need. And
Yeah.
we need kind of, I think, money and funding for all of that because the reality is still,
Yeah.
there's such a disconnect still between mental wellness and physical health. I still don't understand that. Indigenous worldviews trying to help people understand that other Indigenous world, that
Yeah,
holistic
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But we have got to, if I had my way, there'd be, for example, a psychologist in every school,
Yeah.
right? Like, we need to have ways where we make it so easy
Yeah.
for people. And we are sorely lacking here, especially with youth.
All the youth.
Especially with youth.
I have therapists that reach out to me to mentor youth.
Street doctor.
Yep.
Don't you?
Hey,
And I'm like,
Parker didn't tell you about that
Right.
one.
what?
So
I want to hear about the street
I got a
dog.
phone call. I got a phone call. Someone's
that's-
calling me.
That's
Hey,
so wild.
Pam, I know that you're really close to Parker.
That-
So is Parker a psychologist? I'm like, well, he does the work, but I'm like, he could be a street doctor. He's like, honestly, I have a patient and, send it. And I was like, hey, yo, we got a street doctor.
No, I'm
So
not.
that was great. So he's not. Listen, not yet. We got a couple. Anyways, we'll keep that there. But the one thing that it made me think about though is another thing. I remember I had posted about this, and it shocked me actually. It was the dancer Twitch,
Yeah.
who it
Yeah.
was super sad.
That's huge.
And it really
We
made me
watched
think about all the Black
Yeah.
men that
Yeah.
it's like I don't talk about my feelings, like I got my armor on, and
Yeah.
and like I'm not saying all Black men, but I'm saying more so just that like you're locked in your body to not be able to express those emotions.
Yeah.
And even like
The
this
toxic
weekend,
part of
that's the
masculinity.
thing, and it hits different. I feel like
Yeah.
it hits different.
Yeah,
The
for
layers
sure.
are so different.
For sure.
And I wonder, I think that's systemic. I think that's also
Yes.
intentional.
Yep.
And you see that, you know, disproportionately, a lot of these showcase in a lot of really sad ways, like statistically when we look at the incarceration populations and things of that sort. And it's not, it's structural.
Yeah.
You know, like when we talk about the
100%.
access to wellness,
100%.
that's already an issue, but then the added layer of also being a racialized person, that hits different.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's like
100%.
certain levels of access are already difficult when it comes to being a human being. But then on top of that, you add the other intersections.
Yeah.
It makes it so difficult. So I think when I think about just the different ways that we can find alternative forms of care and wellness in this way, you know, as of right now, getting a therapist is amazing, but the access to it is so difficult.
It's not happening.
So then these adding elements of like mentorship and, you know, hanging out with the kid and whatever it may be, I just find that like that is kind of where us as a community can step in. Because I feel like, you know, when I used to accompany my dad to go to the barbershop, I'm hearing all types of stories.
Right?
Things I probably shouldn't know about. But
Right.
I'm just thinking that, you know, that sounded like a therapy session.
I know that's true.
And like, again, that has a cultural context to it as well.
Yeah.
But how do we make it in a way that there's more of these check-ins, that there's more of these alternative forms of wellness that still consider us people, like us racialized folks, in a way that we feel cared for and content to that, you know?
And I think we know that because both of us have been involved in youth groups, like bringing together our youth to sit and just talk about some of the things that you mentioned. This goes back so far, right? This is historic in nature of how our men had to be. And us, we talk about this as well, how we have to monitor our expressions as Black folk. We can't be too aggressive. We can't be too, you know, loud. And it has real world consequence. It's not like just making people uncomfortable. People can get killed, right? And so when you've had years of that, and if it hasn't happened to you personally, although I haven't met a Black person really that it hasn't happened to in some way, it's happening to your brother or your grandfather or, you know, other people in your life, your friends. And you're building all of that. You're wrapping yourself in it. And you add to the fact that you're in a primarily non-Black space all the time. It's no doubt why we see people not being able to release. But this is why it's so important for us community-wise to take steps for that, right? Like we have to do it that way because people aren't going to do it for us, that's for sure.
And I think a lot of people don't have, I know I didn't have the language or the know that I had the agency.
Yeah.
So when I'm in a state of freeze or I feel collapsed, the three things to go is my diet, my sleep, and my attention is just,
preach that.
I'm gone.
Yep.
And I see a lot of brothers out here in that state of freeze. And it is really interesting to me to witness a community moment, I call it, when you get a bunch of us in the room and you're breaking bread, you're having a good time. And you see those shoulders kind of relax. And I'm like, there you are. But as soon as that's over, it's I'm
the armor's back.
I'm back.
And then it's like being medicalized, right? Like all of a sudden there's a reason why Black and brown bodies, especially boys, are overprescribed like everybody has ADHD. Not saying that, of course that's a thing, but it's fascinating when people are assessing people around these issues and doing a checkbox as opposed to looking at it from a cultural lens and what may be going on. And that yes, medication is sometimes needed, but what's the other piece that may be missing? And that's something that we don't even, you can't even like get funded for something like that.
But the language
right?
is there, right?
The language is there.
Can you recall any research or anything happening right now you can think of?
In terms of
that in like the school system, for example.
We have a ton of research that shows when kids get more connected to their racial and cultural identity, everything that you want good increases. So their self-esteem goes up, their body image goes up, and everything you don't want them to do decreases, less likely to misuse drugs. But it's all about being rooted in their racial and cultural identity. in so anything we can do around that, and we lack a lot of that in the schools. This is why we need to be getting into the schools. We need to be creating clubs for our kids in those spaces, you know, Black student unions and all of that. It literally saves lives.
Well, that's a good segue. I just saw the helicopter, because before we started shooting this, you were talking about Black Grad.
Yes.
And all I could think about in my mind was like, I went to school at the wrong time. At the wrong time.
Yeah.
We were grinding.
Yeah, we were fighting for our lives.
Yes.
Grinding.
for our lives.
And now you're able to do things like rally the community
Yep.
and have, what was it, 160 people going to show up
Yep.
in May to celebrate ages from kindergarten to university.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing. That's a core memory. And so when you can create those community moments, I mean, we all need some of that.
I'm telling you, we all need it, and it's core for our community, but also for those who don't know each other. So all those middle school students now are now going to know each other, right? And the high school are now going to know each other. That network is key.
Any final thoughts before we close this one down?
I think that, you know, the more that we can bring up the conversations around therapy to our communities, the stronger we become,
100%.
especially when if there is that access to it, go do it. And if there isn't, let's keep trying to create more spaces of community care within our communities, because that also has a trickle effect to
100%.
communities beyond ours. But I think that check-in of wellness needs to be hugely, hugely emphasized.
Anything else you want to?
I think conversations are so important, and I encourage people, especially now in this digital age where we're bombarded with so much that does sometimes put us in states of freeze, reach out. Put the social media down and reach out. And if you can't find someone to support you in a therapeutic way, try and tap into your community and ask, does anybody have, there is no stigma coming from this side. If you can ask where can I find a counselor who is good in this or good in this? Just ask. Don't do any of this alone. That would be my final thought.
And I agree with you. And I want to say to any of you out there, please reach out. Please reach out. There is, as you can see, no stigma with that. It's so important for you to be able to take care of yourself. And if you feel that you need to just talk to somebody, please reach out to a friend, a family member, if you're in school, a school counselor, somebody in community. But you don't have to suffer alone. Your community's behind you reaching out, and we are sending you vibes to do that, to please, please, please take care of yourself. And so from our family to yours, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again on The Fam. Take care.